Emily's phone vibrated at 3 a.m. A message from an unknown number flashed on the screen. "You can see me now, but I've been watching you for a long time." Her hands trembled as she stared at the words. She was alone in her apartment, wasn't she? The security cameras outside Emily's apartment caught something disturbing. Every night at exactly 2:59 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared at her door, just standing there, watching. She had never seen him in real life, but he had been there every night for weeks. Emily was an ordinary college student living in Chicago. She had a small but comfortable apartment, a tight circle of friends, and a routine that kept her life predictable. But that predictability was about to be shattered. The feeling of being watched. It started subtly, a nagging sensation at the back of her mind whenever she walked home at night. The feeling of unseen eyes following her. She brushed it off at first, blaming it on exhaustion. Then, small things began to change. Her bedroom window, which she always kept closed, was found slightly open one morning. Her favorite coffee mug was misplaced. A faint, unfamiliar scent lingered in her apartment, like someone else had been there. She told herself she was imagining things. Until the messages started. The first message. One night, as she sat in her dimly lit room studying, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. "You looked beautiful in that red sweater today." She froze. She had worn a red sweater that morning. Only her classmates and a few strangers at the cafe had seen her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Who is this?" She typed but then hesitated. If she replied, would that mean she was engaging with them? Before she could decide, another message arrived. Unknown number. "I know you're scared. That's what makes this fun." Her blood turned to ice. The man at the library. The next evening, trying to push away the unease, Emily decided to stay late at the university library. She sat near a window, her books spread out, trying to focus. Then she felt it again, that prickling sensation at the back of her neck. She glanced up. Outside, just beyond the glass, a man stood in the darkness. He was tall, wearing a hood, his face barely visible in the dim streetlight. But she could feel his eyes locked onto hers. She gasped, looking around, expecting someone else to notice. But when she looked back, he was gone. Had she imagined it? The CCTV footage. Shaken, Emily rushed home. As she entered her building, she saw the security guard, an older man named Tom, watching the surveillance screens. On impulse, she asked, "Tom, can you check the footage from outside my apartment?" Tom frowned but rewound the tape. And then there he was. At 2:59 a.m., the same hooded man stood outside her door. Just standing. He never knocked. Never tried to break in. Just watched. And he had been doing this for the past 3 weeks. Emily's stomach twisted into a knot. "What the hell?" she whispered. Tom glanced at her. "Miss Emily, do you know him?" Her throat was dry. No. But he knew her. And he wasn't going away. The open door. That night, Emily double-checked every lock, pushed a chair against the door, and tried to sleep. At exactly 2:59 a.m., her phone buzzed. She hesitated, then picked it up. Unknown number. "I like your new curtains. But they won't stop me from watching." Her breath hitched. She had put up those curtains yesterday. She bolted upright, heart pounding. That meant a soft creak echoed through the apartment. Her bedroom door, which she had locked, was slowly opening. And she wasn't alone anymore. Someone was in the dark. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her bedroom door was slowly opening. She had locked it herself. She was sure of it. But now, the door creaked as if someone on the other side was pushing it open, inch by inch. A chilling realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The message. "I like your new curtains. But they won't stop me from watching." That meant he had been inside. Her hands clenched into fists as she tried to think. She wasn't imagining this. The doorknob turned ever so slightly. Then silence. No footsteps. No movement. Just an eerie, suffocating stillness. Was he still there? Or had he been inside all along? The shadows in the living room. Emily forced herself to breathe. She reached for the bedside lamp, but before she could switch it on, a shadow moved outside her door. Not fast. Not sudden. A slow, deliberate shift, as if someone was waiting just beyond the frame. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and quickly dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? She whispered, barely able to form words. There's someone in my apartment. The dispatcher's voice remained calm. Are you in a safe location? Emily's mind raced. No, I'm trapped. Just then, a soft sound. Not a footstep. Not breathing. Something tapping against the door. Like fingernails scratching. Her stomach turned to ice. "Please send someone," she begged. "We're dispatching officers now." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. Emily gripped her phone as she heard another noise. This time from the living room. A chair scraping against the floor. Whoever was in her apartment was moving her furniture. The man in the hallway. The apartment was small. One hallway led from the bedroom to the living area and kitchen. There were no other exits. If she ran, she'd have to face him. Her breathing grew rapid. The sound of the chair scraping stopped. Then something worse. Footsteps. Coming toward her. Emily's heart nearly exploded in her chest. She bolted. Throwing the door open, she ran straight into the hallway. And froze. A tall figure stood at the end of the hallway, facing her. He didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there. The only thing she could see in the darkness was the outline of his face. A vague, shadowed blur, but she could feel his eyes locked onto her. She couldn't scream. Couldn't run. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You left your window unlocked." The escape. Her body acted before her mind. Emily sprinted toward the front door, fingers clawing at the locks. But her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't grip the latch. Behind her, she heard slow footsteps. Closer. Then a hand on her shoulder. Emily screamed. She twisted free, throwing her full weight against the door. The deadbolt clicked open just as she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. She lunged outside, nearly falling into the apartment hallway. Slamming the door shut, she ran for her life. Down the hall, down the stairs, out into the freezing night air. She didn't stop running until she reached the police station 4 blocks away. The footage. The police took her seriously. An officer escorted her back to the apartment while others searched the building. There was no sign of forced entry. No sign of anyone else. But when they checked the security footage, at 2:59 a.m., a hooded man appeared at her door, like before. But this time, he didn't just stand there. He pulled out a key and walked inside. Emily covered her mouth, while rising in her throat. He had a key, and that meant he could come back anytime. A stranger with a key. Emily sat in the police station, staring at the security footage. A hooded man. A key. A calm, deliberate entry into her home. The worst part, she had never given anyone a spare key. Her mind raced. How did he get it? Was it copied? Stolen? Was he someone she knew? Officer Carter, a stocky man in his 40s, leaned forward. "Miss Emily, do you recognize him?" She shook her head. "No, but he's been watching me for weeks. Standing outside my door. I reported it before." Carter exchanged glances with his partner. "We checked your previous complaints. No prints, no forced entry. But now that we have footage, we'll investigate further. In the meantime, do you have somewhere else to stay?" Emily hesitated. Her best friend, Lisa, lived on the other side of town, but she didn't want to drag her into this. "I can go to a motel," she mumbled. Carter nodded. "That's a good idea. And change your locks immediately." Emily agreed, but deep down she knew a lock wouldn't stop him. The motel room. By 5 a.m., Emily checked into a small motel near downtown. The room was plain, beige walls, a stiff mattress, and old TV. But it had a deadbolt and a chain lock. That made her feel safer. A little. She collapsed onto the bed, exhaustion weighing on her. But sleep didn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the shadow at her door. The man in the hallway, his voice whispering, "You left your window unlocked." By 8 a.m., she gave up trying to sleep. She picked up her phone to text Lisa. And froze. A new message from the unknown number. "Cute motel. Room 203, right?" Emily's stomach dropped. She wasn't safe here either. He's closer than she thought. Heart hammering, Emily bolted upright. She grabbed her bag, ready to run. Then a knock at the door. Soft. Slow. Deliberate. She backed away. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "Don't be scared, Emily. Just open the door." Tears burned her eyes. She wasn't going to die here. Her gaze darted around the room. One window. A bathroom. No weapons. Another knock. Louder this time. Emily's brain screamed, "Run." She grabbed her phone, yanked the motel's landline off the nightstand, and dialed 911. "There's someone outside my room," she whispered, voice shaking. The dispatcher responded quickly. "Stay inside. Officers are on their way." Another knock. Then silence. For 10 minutes, Emily stood frozen, waiting for the door to burst open. But nothing happened. By the time the police arrived, the hallway was empty. No sign of forced entry. No one on the security cameras. It was like he had never been there. But Emily knew better. The stalker's warning. The officers escorted Emily out of the motel and back to the station. Lisa met her there, hugging her tightly. "You're staying with me." No arguments. Emily didn't argue. She couldn't be alone. That night, she and Lisa locked every door and window. They stayed in the same room, too scared to sleep separately. By 3 a.m., Emily's phone buzzed again. She hesitated, then checked the message. Unknown number. "I see you have company. It won't help." Emily nearly dropped the phone. She ran to the window, ripped open the curtains. Outside, across the street, a figure stood under the streetlight. Just standing there. Watching. Lisa rushed to her side. "Oh my God, is that him?" Emily's phone vibrated again. Unknown number. "You can't hide from me." Tears filled her eyes. Nowhere was safe. The final message. The next morning, Lisa took Emily to a locksmith and had her apartment's locks changed. The police were investigating, but they had no leads. The number messaging her was untraceable. By evening, Emily was exhausted. Lisa convinced her to rest while she kept watch. But as soon as Emily closed her eyes, her phone buzzed one last time. With shaking fingers, she unlocked the screen. A photo of her sleeping, taken from inside the house. Emily screamed. Lisa spun around, panicked. What happened? Emily could barely get the words out. He's inside. A game of fear. Emily was no longer just terrified, she was broken. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat. She'd taken all the precautions, but it didn't matter. The man seemed to know everything. Her apartment was locked tight. Her phone was on Do Not Disturb, yet every time she checked, there was a message. The photo of her sleeping, taken from inside her own apartment. She trembled as the police continued their investigation, but they had no leads. The unknown number was untraceable. The locks had been changed. But somehow, he had access to her every move. "How is he doing this?" she whispered, pacing in Lisa's living room. Lisa watched her with concern. "Emily, maybe you should just leave town for a while. Go somewhere he can't find you." But Emily couldn't. She had no idea where he was, or how he was tracking her. Her phone buzzed again. She looked at Lisa, eyes wide with fear. Another message. "I see you, Emily. You can run, but you can't hide." Emily's hands trembled as she read it. Her mind screamed, "He's here." But the apartment was quiet. The walls silent. The only sound was her rapid breath. The silent watcher. Over the next few days, Emily stayed inside, never leaving the house without Lisa. They barely spoke to anyone. Emily was afraid to trust anyone. One evening, as Emily sat by the window in Lisa's living room, she saw something, movement across the street. Someone was standing by the lamppost. Her heart skipped. It was him. She didn't know how she knew, but she just did. It was him. He was watching her again. The figure stood motionless, hidden in the shadows. The only thing visible was the faint outline of a hood. Lisa walked into the room. "What's wrong?" Emily pointed to the window, voice cracking. "He's out there." Lisa rushed to the window, but by the time she looked, the figure was gone. The street was empty. But Emily knew he had been there. And now he was closer than ever. The hidden key. Emily's fears seemed to come to life one night when they returned from a quick trip to the grocery store. Lisa unlocked the front door. But as she pushed it open, a cold rush of air met them. The door wasn't locked. Lisa turned to Emily with confusion. "Did you forget to lock it?" Emily shook her head. "No, I locked it. I swear." The apartment was eerily still. Too still. Suddenly, Emily froze. There on the kitchen counter was a key. It wasn't theirs. It was an old, rusty key. And it had a small engraving, a single letter. E. Emily's eyes widened. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her palm. Her hands were shaking as she whispered, "It's from him. He's been here." Lisa immediately dialed 911, her voice panicked. "There's someone in the house." Again. By the time the police arrived, Emily was nearly hysterical. They checked the apartment, but there was no sign of forced entry. No sign of the stalker. Just the key. He had been inside again. The terror was real. She couldn't hide from him, couldn't escape. The truth revealed. Emily couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. It wasn't safe. Lisa offered to take her to a friend's house out of state, but Emily was reluctant. Would that really stop him? Would he stop following her? That night, as Emily sat on the couch trying to calm her nerves, her phone buzzed. She didn't even want to look anymore. But something pulled her to it. A new message. I'm not done yet, Emily. But you're getting closer to the truth. Emily stared at the screen, her stomach twisting in knots. She glanced at Lisa, who was fast asleep beside her. The quiet of the room was deafening. Suddenly, her mind flashed to the key. The one with the engraving. She had to know more. It was late, but she didn't care. Emily jumped up, grabbing her purse. She had to find the answer. It was time to face the truth. The final revelation. Emily went to the only place she knew to get answers. The old house where she had grown up. Her mother's house. The place where her first memory was a man watching her from the window. A figure that haunted her childhood dreams. She stood in front of the house, staring at it for a long time. Something felt wrong. As she pushed open the front door, the musty smell of old furniture and memories filled her nose. The house was quiet, abandoned almost. No one had lived here in years. She walked through the house slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. And then she saw it. A photo frame, long forgotten, gathering dust on the mantelpiece. It was an old family photo. But the man standing next to her mother wasn't familiar. The man in the photo looked just like the figure who had been stalking her. His eyes cold, emotionless. Her heart raced. She felt the walls closing in around her. The man in the photo was someone she knew. Her father. It hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a random stalker. This was someone from her past, someone who knew her every move. But why now? Why after all these years? As Emily reached out to touch the frame, her phone buzzed again. I've been watching you all along, Emily. It's time to finish what I started. A familiar face. Emily stood frozen in the middle of the living room, staring at the photo of her father. The realization crashed into her mind with the force of a tidal wave. The man who had been stalking her for months wasn't a stranger. It was her father. But why? Her breath became shallow as she recalled the memories of her childhood. The moments of happiness that had been overshadowed by his anger. The moments of fear when she would hide from him in her own home. And then it all made sense. Her father had never disappeared. He had been there all along, hiding in the shadows, watching her from afar. Her hand shook as she reached for her phone, the message from him still lingering on the screen. I've been watching you all along, Emily. It's time to finish what I started. She felt her heart race, the pulse in her neck throbbing. This couldn't be happening. Her father had died years ago. She had seen the coffin. She had mourned him. She had thought she was free. But now, she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Why? Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice trembling as she faced the photo of her father. The house was silent. The only sound was her ragged breathing. And then, the faint creak of a floorboard upstairs. Emily's eyes widened. She wasn't alone. The footsteps. She didn't want to look, but her body betrayed her. Slowly, she turned her head toward the staircase. Her eyes scanned the dimly lit hallway. Nothing. Yet, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. She was certain she had heard something. It was him. Her father. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her phone tighter, the battery dangerously low. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of there, now. But as she turned to run, she froze. The door. It was closed. It had been open when she entered, but now it was locked tight. She felt trapped. The walls seemed to close in around her. There was no escape. Suddenly, a voice whispered from behind her. I see you, Emily. Emily spun around, but no one was there. Her mind was playing tricks on her. The stress, the fear, it was all too much. But then she heard it again, louder this time, as though it was right beside her ear. I see you. Emily's pulse quickened and she gasped. This wasn't her imagination. There was someone in the house. Someone real. Her father. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, trembling uncontrollably. He had never left. The dark truth. Emily's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Her father had always been a complicated man. At first, he had been loving, kind, even protective. But as time went on, something inside him changed. His temper grew more unpredictable, his outbursts more violent. Emily remembered the last time she saw him alive. She had been only 15. The fight had been brutal. Her mother had tried to protect her, but in the end, it was Emily who left, running away to start a new life. She had cut off all ties with him. But now he was back. She stumbled to her feet, tears streaming down her face. Why was he doing this? What had she done to deserve this? The memories flooded her mind. Her father's twisted love, his obsession with control, his anger when she tried to escape. And then it hit her. Her father wasn't just a stalker. He had never stopped watching her. All these years, he had been tracking her, following her every move. He had waited until the right time to come back into her life. Emily gripped the photo of him tightly, her knuckles white. "I won't let you win," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But deep inside, she was unsure if she could stop him. The confrontation. Emily had no choice but to face her past. She couldn't run anymore. Taking a deep breath, she marched up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was still eerily silent. But Emily knew that her father was there, somewhere in the darkness. The second floor was just as abandoned as the first. But as she walked down the hallway, she stopped. The door to her father's old study. It had been locked for years. But now it was slightly ajar. She pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty house. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the shadows casting long, ominous shapes across the walls. And there, sitting at the desk, was a figure. It was her father. But he wasn't the man she remembered. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes, those eyes, were hollow, devoid of any humanity. "You've been a disappointment, Emily." His voice was cold, devoid of emotion, as he stood up from the chair. Emily's heart raced as she backed away. "No, you're wrong. I'm not going to be your prisoner anymore." Her father smiled, a twisted, cruel smile that sent chills down her spine. "You never escaped. You were always mine." Emily could feel her sanity slipping away. The walls of the study seemed to close in around her. She needed to get out. But as she turned to run, she heard the door slam shut behind her. She was trapped. The final escape. With nowhere left to go, Emily knew she had only one option. She had to fight back. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy bookend. It was the only weapon she could find. Her father advanced toward her slowly, his eyes cold, his smile widening with each step. "You can't escape me. Not anymore." Emily swung the bookend with all her strength, striking him in the chest. But it was like hitting a brick wall. He didn't even flinch. With terrifying speed, he grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground. Emily struggled to breathe, her vision fading as he squeezed harder. "You'll never leave. You'll never be free." Her mind raced. She needed to escape, but how? And then she remembered. The window. With one final burst of energy, Emily kicked him in the stomach, sending him stumbling back. She didn't wait. She ran to the window, throwing it open. It was her only chance. But as she climbed out onto the ledge, she felt a hand grab her ankle. Her father had followed her. Emily screamed, but it was too late. He pulled her back inside, and as he raised his hand to strike her, Emily made a choice. She jumped. As she fell, everything went dark. The last thing she remembered was the sound of her father's laughter. The awakening. The first thing Emily felt was pain. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and she could barely make sense of where she was. It was dark, and the air smelled damp, stale. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy. She could barely open her eyes. She struggled to remember what had happened. Had she escaped? Was she dead? Slowly, her vision began to clear. The blurred shapes around her became more defined, and she realized she was lying on a cold, hard floor. A basement. The walls were made of rough stone, and the only light came from a dim, flickering bulb overhead. Emily pushed herself to a sitting position, gasping for air. The pain in her chest made it hard to breathe. She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her weight. Suddenly, a voice spoke, cold and distant. "You thought you could escape." Emily's heart skipped a beat. The voice. It was him. Her father. She turned around quickly, but the darkness in the corner of the room revealed nothing. "You're never truly free," the voice continued. A chill ran down her spine. She tried to scream, but her voice was strangled by the fear clawing at her throat. No, this can't be happening. Her father couldn't have survived the fall, could he? And if she had survived, was this some twisted punishment he had devised for her? Emily's breath became ragged. She needed to find a way out. But no matter how hard she looked, she could see no door, no window, nothing that resembled an exit. "There is no escape, Emily. You belong to me." Emily's pulse raced. She was trapped again. She felt her heart pound in her chest as she scrambled to find an answer, to find a way out. But there was nothing. And then a door creaked open from somewhere behind her. Emily froze. Time to face the truth. Confrontation with the past. Emily was too scared to move, too terrified to even breathe. She didn't want to look, but her body betrayed her once again, slowly turning her head toward the door. The light in the room flickered one last time before casting a long shadow across the floor. A figure appeared in the doorway. It was him, her father, but he wasn't the man she remembered. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt, his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. His skin looked pale and stretched tight over his bones, like something had been eating away at him for years. "What happened to you?" Emily whispered, her voice shaking. Her father's smile only grew wider. "I never left you, Emily. You just didn't see me." He took a slow step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. The room felt smaller, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her. Emily's breathing became shallow, her mind racing. Was he a ghost? Or something worse? "You never wanted to face me, did you? You thought you could run away from the truth." His voice was like a venomous whisper, filled with disdain. "But you'll never escape what I've made you." Emily stood up, stumbling on shaky legs. She had to get away. She couldn't stay here. But as she looked around, she realized she was cornered. There was no way out. "You can't escape the truth, Emily. You were always mine," her father continued, his voice growing more distorted. Emily's mind spun. She had to think. She couldn't let him control her again. "No," she said aloud. "You're not my father anymore. You're just a monster." Her words seemed to anger him. His eyes narrowed, and his smile twisted into a snarl. "I made you, Emily. You're nothing without me." He lunged at her with terrifying speed, and Emily screamed, barely managing to dodge his grasp. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her mind screamed for escape. What had happened to her father? Was he even human? And then the answer came to her. Her father hadn't died. He had become something else. The revelation. Emily backed away, her mind racing. Was this some sort of nightmare? Her father had never truly been the man she remembered. He had always been controlling, manipulative, and twisted. But now he was something darker, something inhuman. What had happened to him? The answer seemed to come out of nowhere. The basement. Emily's heart stopped as the memories flooded back. Her father had always been obsessed with control. He had kept her confined, emotionally and physically, for years. She had tried to escape, to free herself from the pain, but in the end, it was she who had been trapped by her own fears, trapped by the emotional scars he had left on her. Now she was here, stuck in the dark, and he was right in front of her, the monster he had always been. "You're mine," her father's voice echoed, deep and guttural. "You always will be." Emily shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. She needed to think. She needed to get out of this place. But the walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder, and she realized there was nowhere left to run. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket, the screen lighting up with a text message. "I'm coming for you." Emily's blood ran cold. She had seen that message before, but this time, it wasn't from her father. It was from someone else. And then, the door slammed open behind her. She turned just in time to see the silhouette of another figure, moving quickly toward her. Who was it now? The new threat. Emily's mind raced as she looked at the new figure entering the room. This wasn't her father. It was a stranger. "You're too late," the voice sneered from the shadows. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Who was this person? Before she could make sense of the situation, the stranger stepped into the light. His face was cold, emotionless, and his eyes gleamed with a twisted, unnerving pleasure. He was wearing a black jacket, and his face was obscured by a mask, one that looked eerily familiar. The mask. It was the same one that had appeared in the video she had received weeks ago. "You should have never come back, Emily," he said, his voice cold and menacing. Emily's pulse quickened. She didn't understand. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I'm the one who's been watching you all along." Emily's heart raced. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore. Was her father somehow involved in this? Or was this something even darker than she could imagine? But the more she thought, the more she realized one thing. This wasn't just about her father anymore. This was a game, and she was the pawn. The stranger's truth. Emily's breath hitched as the stranger stepped closer, the mask hiding his true face. Her heart pounded in her chest as she desperately tried to make sense of the situation. This was no coincidence. He knew her. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking with both fear and defiance. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. His gaze locked onto hers, and she could feel the weight of his stare piercing through her. "You're a part of something much bigger than you think, Emily," he finally said, his voice cold and calculating. Emily's mind raced. What was he talking about? She backed away, but the walls of the basement seemed to close in around her. There was no way out, no escape from the twisted reality that was tightening its grip on her. "You've been followed, watched," the stranger continued. "This isn't just your father's doing. It's bigger. So much bigger." Emily tried to understand, but the pieces of the puzzle didn't fit. She felt like she was drowning in confusion, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "I don't know what you want," she said, her voice faltering. "But I won't be a part of whatever sick game you're playing." The stranger's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. Just a chilling sense of superiority. "You don't have a choice." Emily's blood ran cold. She felt her heart drop into her stomach. This wasn't just some random person. He knew everything about her fears, her past, and now her future. Her father had always controlled her, manipulated her with guilt and fear. But now this stranger, this masked figure, was taking things to a whole new level. "You're already a part of it," he whispered. "The web is tightening around you, Emily. And soon, you won't be able to escape." She had to fight back. She had to find a way out. But there was no way out. Not now. The stranger took another step toward her, and she knew deep down that there was nowhere left to run. The unseen threat. Emily's heart raced as the masked figure circled her, his every move deliberate and calculated. She could feel the weight of his presence, the oppressive air growing thicker with every step he took. She was trapped. Her mind raced, searching for a way to escape, but there was no obvious exit. The basement felt like a maze, the walls closing in on her. She was running out of time. "You think you can run, but you can't," the stranger taunted, his voice low and mocking. "I've been watching you for so long, Emily. I know your every move." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. She had to escape. There had to be a way out. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The stranger paused, tilting his head as if considering the question. His eyes gleamed with a dark, twisted amusement. "I want you to understand. I want you to see the truth." "The truth? What truth?" Emily's mind was spinning. She had no idea what he was talking about. All she knew was that she had to get out of this nightmare. "I'll never understand you," she said, her voice growing steadier despite the fear gnawing at her. "I'll never be a part of your sick game." But the stranger didn't respond to her defiance. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, glowing device. Emily's breath caught in her throat as he held it out in front of him, the light casting an eerie glow on his mask. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is where everything changes." Before Emily could react, the device emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound, and she felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over her. Her vision blurred, and her legs gave way beneath her. She fell to the ground, her mind spinning in a haze of confusion and terror. What was happening? "You're mine now, Emily," the stranger said, his voice distant, as if coming from somewhere far away. The darkness closed in around her, and she lost consciousness. The nightmare realized. When Emily opened her eyes again, the world around her was different. She was no longer in the basement. She was in a small, dimly lit room, lying on a bed. Her body felt heavy, as if she had been drugged. She tried to sit up, but the room spun around her. She groaned, clutching her head in an attempt to steady herself. The pain was intense, like a vice around her skull. "You're awake," a voice said from the corner of the room. Emily's eyes darted toward the sound. There, in the shadows, stood the stranger. "What is this? Where am I?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You're in the center of it all now, Emily. You're part of the plan." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "The plan? What plan?" "You're not just a victim," the stranger continued. "You're a player, a pawn in a much larger game." Emily's pulse quickened. She had no idea what he was talking about, but she knew one thing for sure. She had to get out of there, and fast. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice breaking. "I don't want any part of this." The stranger didn't flinch. "You don't have a choice. You never did." Emily's mind raced. She had to think of something. Anything. But the more she thought, the more she realized she was being pulled into something far beyond her control. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was fighting for her sanity. "You're not just a victim," the stranger repeated, his voice growing more menacing. "You're the key." Emily's blood ran cold. The key. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing down as her world shattered into 1,000 pieces. What had she become a part of? The revelation. The stranger stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Emily. The room was suffocating, and she could barely breathe. "Do you know why you're here, Emily?" he asked, his voice calm and almost gentle, like he was explaining something to a child. Emily's pulse raced. She had no idea. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The stranger smiled, his mask reflecting the dim light. "You're the final piece, Emily. You're the one who will set everything in motion." Emily stared at him, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean?" The stranger leaned forward, his eyes dark and intense. "You've been marked, Emily. You always have been. Your father knew it. And now so do I." He stepped back and raised his hand, revealing a small, jagged scar on his palm. "This scar marks you as the key to unlocking something bigger than you can imagine." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "You're not just a victim," the stranger repeated, his tone cold. "You're the one who will end it all." And in that moment, Emily realized something she hadn't been able to grasp before. She wasn't just trapped by the past. She was being pulled into something much darker. And there was no way out. The key to the past. Emily's mind was reeling from the stranger's revelation. She was the key. She had no idea what that meant, but the weight of the words felt suffocating. The stranger's face remained obscured by the mask, but his eyes, those cold, predatory eyes, felt as if they were piercing through her very soul. "What does that mean?" Emily managed to whisper, her voice hoarse from the fear that had wrapped itself around her throat. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He stepped back into the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate. "You don't understand yet, do you?" he said, his voice now tinged with a mocking amusement. "You're the one who will break the chain, Emily. You're the one who will undo everything your father started." Emily's stomach churned. Her father. The thought of him twisted her insides. "What did my father have to do with this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The stranger's smile widened beneath the mask, his voice dropping to an eerie whisper. "Your father made a deal. A pact. And you are the result of that deal." Emily's chest tightened as the words hit her like a blow. What was he talking about? Her father, who had always seemed so distant, so controlling, had made some kind of deal? "A deal," she repeated, her voice shaking. The stranger's laugh was cold and low, as if he was savoring her confusion. "Yes, a deal. And now, it's your turn to finish what he started." Her mind was a blur. The stranger's words were like shards of broken glass, each one piercing deeper into her consciousness. She was supposed to finish something her father had started? What kind of deal was he referring to? Emily's hands trembled as she tried to grasp the reality of the situation. She had always been a prisoner of her father's influence, but this was something far darker. "I'm not a part of this," she said, her voice filled with determination. "I don't care what my father did. I'm not going to be your puppet." The stranger's smile faltered, just for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't have a choice," he said, his tone almost pitiful. "You never did." Emily stood up, her legs unsteady, but she had to keep going. She had to find a way out of this nightmare. "I will find a way," she whispered to herself, though the uncertainty lingered in her heart. The horror unfolds. Days passed, though Emily couldn't be sure if it was hours or weeks. Time seemed to lose its meaning in the dark, claustrophobic room she was held in. Each passing moment felt like a new layer of the nightmare closing in on her. The stranger never stayed in the same place for long, but his presence was always felt. The sound of his footsteps, the weight of his gaze, it was like being constantly watched. One night, as Emily lay in the bed, staring at the cracked ceiling above her, she heard a faint noise. A scrape followed by the sound of something, or someone, moving in the shadows. Her pulse quickened, and she instinctively shrank back. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice breaking the eerie silence. The response came not with words, but with a low, guttural growl from the dark corner of the room. Her heart skipped a beat. The growl was unnatural, inhuman. It seemed to echo through the walls. Before she could react, a figure stepped into the dim light. It was tall and hunched, its movements jerky and disjointed. Its face was a blur of shadows, but its eyes, those eyes, gleamed with an unsettling hunger. Emily gasped and scrambled backward, her hands pressing into the cold, hard floor. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Who are you? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, as if observing her. Emily's breath caught in her throat as it took a step forward. She couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, a sense of paralyzing terror overtaking her. You should have never come here, Emily, the figure muttered, its voice guttural, like a whisper from the depths of hell. You're in too deep. Emily's mind reeled. She wasn't just being stalked by the stranger. There was something more, something far worse, lurking in the shadows. She pushed herself to her feet, but her legs felt like jelly. The figure was getting closer, its breath now a heavy rasp in the stillness of the room. No, Emily whispered. Stay away from me. But the figure didn't listen. It lunged toward her, its hands reaching out with an unnatural speed. In a panic, Emily screamed, her voice hoarse and raw. She pushed herself backward, away from the figure, and her hand landed on something cold, something solid. She turned and grabbed it. A metal bar, part of the bed frame. She swung it at the figure, hitting it with all her strength. The figure let out an inhuman shriek, staggering backward. Emily didn't waste any time. She bolted toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. But as her fingers wrapped around the cold doorknob, she realized it was locked. She yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was recovering. You can't escape, the figure hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. You'll never escape. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find another way out. She had to think. She couldn't let this thing get her. Suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos. Emily! It was the stranger. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Leave her alone, he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. To Emily's shock, the figure hesitated. For a moment, it stood still, like it was being controlled by the stranger's presence. Go, the stranger said, his voice brokering no argument. Leave her. This isn't your time. With a final, menacing glance at Emily, the figure retreated into the shadows, disappearing from sight. Emily stood frozen, her heart still racing. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified than ever. The stranger stepped toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. You're in more danger than you realize, he said, his voice softer now, almost sympathetic. Emily could barely process the words. She had just faced something unimaginable, and now this masked man was standing in front of her, speaking like nothing had happened. I need to know the truth, Emily said, her voice filled with desperation. What's going on? What do you want from me? The stranger's gaze hardened, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're the key, Emily. The truth is far worse than you could ever imagine. And as he spoke those chilling words, Emily knew that her fight for survival had only just begun. The chilling realization. The masked stranger's words echoed in Emily's mind, each syllable clawing at her sanity. You're the key. What did that even mean? How could she be the key to something? Her body trembled, not just from fear, but from a growing sense of dread, like she was standing on the edge of an abyss. Emily's gaze flickered to the corner of the room, where the figure had vanished into the shadows just moments earlier. That thing, it hadn't been human. Its twisted form and the guttural growl that had come from it would haunt her forever. The stranger, who had appeared to save her, was no better. His silence only deepened the mystery, and the more he spoke, the more terrifying the truth seemed. The truth is far worse than you could ever imagine, he had said. What truth? She demanded, her voice shaking with the weight of her fear. The stranger took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. His presence was suffocating, and the air in the room grew thick with tension. I will show you, he replied, his voice low and foreboding. But as he reached for the door, the world seemed to shift. The walls around Emily seemed to close in, and the room, once familiar, now felt like a twisted labyrinth. The shadows lengthened, and the flickering light from the lone bulb overhead cast strange shapes against the walls. No, Emily whispered, a sudden wave of panic surging through her. This place, it's changing. The stranger turned back to her, his expression unreadable behind the mask. It's not the place that's changing, he said slowly. It's you. The dark truth about her father. The words felt like a slap to the face. It's you. She had no idea what he meant by that, but the sense of fear and dread that coursed through her veins told her she didn't want to know. What do you mean? She asked, her voice cracking as she took a step back. The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the door, his hand hovering just above the handle. For a moment, there was silence. Then, without turning back to look at her, he spoke. Your father, he wasn't just a man. He was a vessel, a part of something far older, far darker than you can comprehend. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her father, a vessel for something dark? This didn't make sense. Her father had always been distant, controlling, but he was just a man. Wasn't he? The stranger continued, his voice taking on a more somber tone. Your father made a choice. And that choice bound him to a pact. But it didn't just bind him. It bound you too. Emily's legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed onto the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. A pact? What kind of pact? She gasped, her throat dry, as if the very air had turned to dust. The stranger finally turned to face her. His eyes, cold and detached, bore into hers. A pact with something older than time itself. A force that thrives on fear, on pain, on suffering. And now, that force wants its due. Emily shook her head, trying to make sense of the words. What does it want from me? The stranger hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of what he was about to reveal. You are the key, Emily, he said quietly. You are the only one who can end it. The ancient power. The stranger led Emily down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls around them were cold to the touch, covered in what appeared to be an ancient moss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air smelled damp, like something long forgotten, and the silence was almost unbearable. Every step Emily took echoed in the silence, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As they walked deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, the temperature dropped. Emily's breath began to form into small, trembling clouds in front of her. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The stranger didn't answer, but Emily could feel his presence behind her, his gaze unwavering. She wanted to turn around, to face him, but something held her back. The need to know what was happening, what had happened, was too great. Finally, after what felt like hours, they arrived at a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, save for an altar at the far end. The altar was made of black stone, and it radiated an energy that felt wrong. Emily's skin prickled with fear as she stepped inside, her feet hesitant on the cold stone floor. The stranger motioned toward the altar. This is where it began, he said, his voice low and almost reverent. This is where your father's pact was sealed. Emily approached the altar cautiously, her eyes narrowing at the strange symbols carved into the stone. She recognized some of them, ancient runes her father had kept hidden from her. But there was something more. She reached out a hand to touch the surface of the altar, and the moment her fingers made contact, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thick with energy, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. It's calling you, the stranger said, his voice tinged with a warning. You must understand, Emily. You are the one who can break this. You must take the step your father never could. Her fingers began to tingle as they rested on the altar, and in that moment, Emily realized something horrifying. She wasn't just the key. She was part of the ritual. She was bound to it. Her father's pact had not just been a contract, it was a sacrifice. A sacrifice that had chosen her. The choice. Emily stumbled back, her heart racing as the realization crashed over her. No, she gasped. I don't want this. I didn't ask for this. The stranger's mask remained emotionless, but there was something in his voice that almost sounded regretful. It's not a matter of wanting it, Emily. It's a matter of necessity. You are the one who can end it all. Emily's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. How? How can I end it? She demanded. The stranger stepped forward, his voice growing colder. You must sacrifice what you hold most dear. Only then will the force be released. Only then can you break the cycle. Her mind raced. She wouldn't sacrifice anyone. I won't do it, Emily said firmly. There has to be another way. But deep down, she knew there wasn't. She knew that the force, the darkness, would never stop hunting her. It would follow her until the end of time if she didn't make the choice. Then you will never be free, the stranger said, his voice laced with finality. Emily closed her eyes, the weight of her fate pressing down on her. She was trapped. The final decision. The world around her blurred, and for a moment, Emily felt the overwhelming sensation of falling. Her mind screamed for an escape, for an answer, anything. But the only thing that remained was the altar, the choice she had to make. With trembling hands, she reached for the altar again, her fingers brushing the ancient symbols. The room seemed to respond, vibrating with energy. And as she closed her eyes, the world around her went black. It's time, Emily. The descent into darkness. When Emily's eyes opened, the world around her was no longer the same. The walls had disappeared, and in their place was an endless void, stretching out into infinity. The air was thick with an oppressive force that seemed to squeeze the breath from her lungs. Her body trembled, as if the very ground she stood on was shifting beneath her. She tried to move, but her feet felt glued to the spot, and her heartbeat hammered in her chest like a drum. Emily! The voice echoed from nowhere, yet it felt so close, so real. Her name, spoken in a tone she could not place, rang out through the vast emptiness. It sent a wave of panic surging through her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, only the darkness. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The darkness responded with silence. But the weight of the voice lingered, like a shadow wrapping around her mind. And then, from the corner of her eye, something began to move. It wasn't a figure at first, just a flicker of light, a spark of something alive in the abyss. But as her gaze fixed on it, the shape slowly became clearer. A figure, tall, unnaturally slender, its outline shifting like smoke in the night. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow, and Emily could feel its gaze on her, cutting through the darkness, freezing her in place. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The terror gripped her throat, rendering her silent. "You've come, Emily," the voice said again, this time colder, more distorted. It was coming from the figure, but it sounded like 1,000 voices blended into one. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as the figure took a step closer, its feet barely touching the ground. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring her fear. "I don't want this," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. The figure stopped, just inches away. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and Emily felt something dark stir within her. Something ancient, something connected to her very being. "But you are the one," it said, its voice like an unsettling whisper inside her mind. "You are the key. You always have been." The revelation. Emily's head was spinning. The words, the reality, was too much to process. "What do you mean?" she demanded, trying to steady her breathing. The figure tilted its head, a strange and eerie gesture, like it was studying her. "The pact your father made, it was never just about him. It was always about you, Emily. You were born for this moment. You are the one who can break the chain that has kept us bound for centuries." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just the victim of a cruel twist of fate. She was the one who had the power to end it all. To break the curse. To release this thing that had been haunting her family for generations. But it wasn't that simple, was it? Nothing ever was. "What must I do?" Emily asked, her voice trembling, though she refused to back down. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and a sickening smile twisted its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You must give up the one thing that binds you to the mortal world," it said. "The one thing that makes you human." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered. "I won't sacrifice anyone." The figure's grin widened. "It's not a matter of choice. It's the only way. You must sacrifice your soul, Emily. Only then can you release the power that has kept us bound in the shadows." The struggle. Emily's mind reeled at the suggestion. Her soul? The very thought of it made her stomach twist. But there was something else, something even more terrifying, nagging at the back of her mind. The promise of freedom. The promise of breaking free from the chains that had bound her to this horror for so long. She thought of her father, his distant, controlling ways, and the twisted truth about his pact. Was this the price he had paid? Was this the curse he had passed on to her? Her legs trembled beneath her, but she didn't fall. Instead, she stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with fury. "I won't give up my soul. There has to be another way." The figure's eyes flashed with a dangerous gleam. "There is no other way, Emily. You know it deep down. Your soul is the key to the darkness, and only through sacrifice can you release the world from its grasp." Emily shook her head, trying to push the fear away. There had to be another way. There always was. "I won't do it," she repeated. "I won't be your pawn." The final choice. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air felt heavier, as though the very atmosphere was thickening with the weight of her decision. She could feel the darkness pressing in on her, urging her to give in, to surrender. She could almost hear the whispers of countless souls lost in the shadows, urging her to join them, to end the torment once and for all. But something deep inside her resisted. Something stronger than the fear. The desire for freedom. The desire for her own life. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I refuse," she said firmly, though her voice wavered with the intensity of her emotions. "I will fight. I will find another way." The figure hissed, its form shuddering with anger. The air grew heavy with dark energy, and Emily felt a surge of power pulse around her, testing her resolve. But she held her ground, her fists clenched at her sides. "Then you will suffer the consequences, Emily," the figure warned, its voice now filled with a chilling malice. "You cannot escape your fate. You never could." But even as it spoke, something shifted in Emily. A glimmer of hope. A spark of rebellion. "Watch me," she whispered. With all the strength she could muster, Emily pushed against the darkness, not with force, but with willpower. She had the power to make her own choice, to break free. And as she stood there, defiant, the room around her began to crumble. The darkness that had once surrounded her started to fade, disintegrating like ash in the wind. The aftermath. When Emily opened her eyes again, the darkness was gone. The room was no longer a void. It was a place she recognized. She was back in the familiar, cold stone chamber, standing before the altar. The stranger was gone. The figure was gone. Everything was still. But Emily knew one thing. She had made her choice. She had not sacrificed her soul. She had not given in. And somehow that was enough. But as she stood there, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. The battle wasn't over. The darkness might have been banished for now, but it would return. It always did. And she, Emily, would be ready. The end.